the locked door. Sarah stood shaking in the quiet hallway of Woodville High, staring down at the locker that had become her worst nightmare. Its door was sealed tight, streaked with a glistening trail of industrial glue that shimmered under the harsh fluorescent lights. Someone had forced the resin deep into the hinges and the tiny spaces where the door met the frame, making sure it would never open. Her breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as she pressed a trembling hand against the metal. This was the second time this month. The first had been a broken combination lock. The second, a crude "Go Home" scrawled in crimson paint across the door. But this was different. This felt calculated, meant to humiliate. A low whistle came from down the hall. "Looks like someone's stuck for good." Sarah spun, brushing hot tears from her cheeks. A group of girls stood clustered near the water fountain. At the center was Tara, tall, blonde, and impossibly confident, the unofficial queen of Woodville High. Tara winked and shrugged. "Better call the janitor. New girl. Might take a while." A ripple of laughter rose from the group, and Sarah felt herself shrink. It wasn't just about the locker anymore. Not about a broken door or a ruined book inside. It was about making sure she knew her place, making sure she felt like she didn't belong. Sarah refused to give Tara the satisfaction. She pulled herself together, wiped the sting of tears from her eyes, and lifted her chin. "Why?" she asked quietly, voice shaking. "Why are you doing this?" Tara smirked, brushing a strand of hair from her immaculate ponytail. "Why? Because we can. Because you don't fit in. Because someone needs to teach you how things work here." Sarah said nothing, but inside, something twisted, a mix of anger and grief. They didn't know her. They didn't know what she'd lost, or why she came to this school in the first place. They didn't understand that every night she came home to an empty house where silence was her only company, and every morning she pulled herself together to walk into a world that felt like a war zone. Sarah pressed a palm to the locker and felt the sting of dried glue. Somehow, this was the final straw. That night, she refused to cry herself to sleep. Instead, she pulled out a notebook and started to write. Not a diary entry, not a plea for help, a plan. Every word felt like a release. Every line felt like a step closer to gaining back the piece of herself that the bullies had tried to destroy. Sarah was quiet, shy, and overlooked, but she had a secret. A gift her father had taught her long ago. Not one that she flaunted, not one she spoke of aloud, but one that gave her strength when the world tried to break her. While the rest of Woodville High thought she was an awkward, lonely girl, Sarah possessed an uncanny ability to read people. Not just faces, but gestures, habits, moments of vulnerability. And she had learned long ago that knowing people was like knowing where to land a blow or offer a hand. That Sarah would make sure this was the last time Tara, or anyone else, humiliated her. Days passed. The locker remained sealed, and Sarah refused to ask for help. Instead, she came to school early and stood by it every morning, brushing her fingers across the dried glue as if making a silent promise. No one noticed when she started showing up 10 minutes earlier, or when she started carrying a small, plain notebook pressed tight to her chest. But she noticed everything. She watched as Tara winked across the room at the school's star quarterback, as Tara pressed herself closer to him every chance she got. She watched as Amanda, Tara's best friend, nervously checked her phone every few seconds. As Kyle, the boy everyone assumed was Tara's boyfriend, clenched and unclenched his fists. Every time another guy spoke to her, Sarah watched, and she learned. Each night she went home and added to the pages a map of connections, tensions, secrets buried just out of sight. The quiet girl with the sealed locker was more dangerous than anyone imagined. Then came the moment that changed everything. Sarah had stayed late after school to practice in the music room. The sound of the old piano felt like a salve for the sting of the day. But as she left, she spotted Tara and Kyle at the end of the hallway, arguing quietly. Kyle was shaking his head, voice rising. "If you don't tell him, Tara, I will." Sarah froze. Through the sliver of a slightly open door, she watched as Tara pulled Kyle closer and pressed a finger to his lips. "Shut up, Kyle. This doesn't involve you." "What doesn't involve me?" he spat. "That you've been cheating, or that you don't give a damn about any of us." Sarah felt her breath catch. The perfect couple was breaking apart before her eyes. Tara, the girl who acted like she owned this school, was cheating. Suddenly, every glance, every whispered conversation she'd observed made sense. Sarah pulled away from the door and pressed herself into the dark hallway, heart beating wildly, not because she felt fear, not because she felt guilt for eavesdropping, but because she felt the first stirrings of power. This was a crack in Tara's armor, one that Sarah could use. That night, Sarah added the scene to her notebook. Not a diary entry, but a piece of a larger picture. She started making connections between Tara and Kyle, Tara and the mysterious boy she met after class. The way Amanda's voice shook when she spoke to Tara. Sarah didn't want to just expose Tara. She wanted to make her understand the sting she felt every morning at the sight of that sealed locker. The sting that came with knowing she was unseen, unwanted, unworthy. Sarah would make sure that sting was felt 10 times over. Days turned into weeks. The locker remained sealed, a grim monument to Tara's cruelty, but Sarah refused to let it break her. Instead, she smiled at the sting, let it fuel her resolve. Then came the day she found the piece she needed, in the back room of the music department, buried between old sheet music and forgotten cables. She overheard Tara and Amanda. "She doesn't deserve this." Amanda was whispering, "It's too much. She asked for it." Tara snapped, "That girl needs to learn where she stands." "What about Kyle?" Amanda pressed. "If he finds out about Tyler, then he finds out," Tara said coldly. "But if you say one word to anyone, Amanda, you're finished. Do you understand?" Sarah sank down in the corner, breathless. Tyler, not Kyle, not some random boy, but Tyler, the one person Kyle trusted more than anyone. Tara was cheating, and she had dragged Amanda into her mess. Sarah smiled, not out of cruelty, but out of knowing that this was more than teenage drama. This was betrayal. This was the moment she would reclaim her voice. The next morning, the locker was still sealed. The laughter still came from the same group of girls. But for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt calm. She pressed a hand to the locker and spoke softly, so low that only she could hear herself. "Go ahead and laugh. Do what you must, but this ends soon." Then she walked down the hallway with a quiet grace that no one noticed except Amanda. The girl's eyes met hers for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, Sarah smiled, not in malice, not in victory, but in knowing. That afternoon, Tara received a text. An anonymous number, just a link to a video that no one was supposed to have, a video that would ruin everything. That as Tara clicked it, her knees buckled, and the sound of her own voice whispering Tyler's name filled the air. The room went silent. Someone had seen, someone had recorded, someone was ready to make her pay. Sarah stood in the hallway, leaning against the sealed locker, and watched as Tara sank to the floor, phone shaking in her hands. Then, for the first time in weeks, Sarah smiled. The game had just begun. The fracture the next morning felt different. Sarah arrived at Woodville High earlier than usual, brushing a hand across the dried, crusted edges of her sealed locker. The glue was still there, a bitter reminder of the cruelty she refused to forget. But for the first time she felt strong. In the hallway, whispers floated like mist. Tara had been spotted the night before, running out of the school's west doors with streaked mascara and shaking hands. Amanda had called in sick. Kyle, the star quarterback, hadn't shown up for practice. The air itself felt charged, like a storm about to break. Sarah tightened her grip on the notebook pressed to her chest. All those nights of piecing together moments, glimpses of betrayal between Tara, Kyle, and Tyler, were about to pay off. The first stone had been thrown, and now the ripples would move through the school like wildfire. But for now, she kept quiet, kept herself unseen, let the tension rise. By lunch, the gossip had taken root. She was with Tyler. Everyone's saying she cheated. "Are you serious, Tara?" The terror. Apparently Kyle dumped her right before practice. Wait, Tyler, as in Kyle's best friend. Sarah stood by the lunch line, listening as the threads tangled, as the lies and truths twisted together, until no one knew which was which. The stories weren't coming from her mouth. She didn't need to say a word. Tara had built her kingdom on whispers and cruelty, and now the whispers were burning it down. Sarah spotted Amanda across the cafeteria. The girl was pale, picking at a salad, ignoring the way people glanced in her direction. Amanda knew. Amanda had been Tara's shadow, witness to every betrayal, every sneered comment. Amanda had been one of the girls giggling when Sarah's locker was sealed. Sarah pulled a deep breath and crossed the room. "May I sit?" she asked quietly. Amanda looked up, shocked, like she was staring at a ghost. "Why are you What do you want? Sarah placed her notebook on the table and smiled faintly, not in cruelty, but in understanding. I want to ask you a question. Do you want this to end? Amanda froze. Her fork shook slightly. Why are you doing this? She whispered. Why aren't you yelling? Why aren't you telling the principal? Sarah shook her head slowly. Yelling doesn't fix anything, and telling the principal, that just gives Tara a chance to twist the story. But you can fix this. You can tell the truth. You can walk away from her. Amanda sank into herself, swallowing hard. You don't understand. Tara doesn't just let go of people. She ruins them. Everything you're feeling, she'll make sure it's 10 times worse for me. Sarah felt a sting in her chest, but she refused to flinch. Instead, she pulled the notebook closer and tapped it with a finger. I've been watching. You're tired. You don't want to be part of this anymore. All I'm asking is that when the time comes, you tell the truth. Not for me, not for revenge, but for yourself. For a moment, Amanda said nothing. Then, slowly, she nodded, brushing away a single tear. Sarah stood and left the table. The first crack in Tara's circle had appeared. The rest of the day was a blur of tension. Tara refused to leave the locker room except for brief moments. Tyler refused to acknowledge her, and Kyle looked like a boy whose world had fallen apart. Sarah watched from the sidelines, saying nothing, but every glance she gave, every quiet smile she offered, felt like a calculated piece falling into place. Then came the second shift. After school, in the deserted hallway where her locker still stood sealed, Sarah noticed a figure lurking in the shadows. At first, she ignored it, brushing a finger across the dried glue. But then the figure stepped out. It was Kyle. He didn't move closer. He didn't speak until she turned. But when she met his eyes, she felt a wave of raw emotion rise in her. Cliff, not because she liked him, she didn't. Not because she felt sorry for him, she didn't. But because she understood the sting of betrayal. Why didn't you tell anyone? He asked suddenly, voice low and hoarse. About the locker, the glue. Everyone knows it was Tara. Why didn't you just expose her? Sarah tightened her grip on the strap of her bag. Because a quick punishment doesn't teach a lesson. It doesn't make someone feel what you felt. What I felt. Kyle watched her for a long moment. What are you doing then? Sarah shrugged. I'm making sure she knows. Making sure everyone knows. Not just that she's a bully, but that she's a liar. Not just about a locker. Not just about a prank. She met his gaze and spoke slowly. About everything. Kyle sank down against the lockers, brushing a hand across his hair. Sarah, why? Why go this far? Sarah felt the sting of tears rise, but refused to let them fall. Instead, she pulled out a single photo from the pages of her notebook, one she had taken from a distance. A picture of Tara and Tyler in the alley behind the school, the evidence that had started it all. Because no one deserves to be humiliated. Not like this. She placed the photo down beside him, resting her hand on the locker that still bore dried streaks of glue. I didn't ask for this. But if no one else is going to stand up to her, then I will. Then she walked away, leaving Kyle holding the picture that would shatter the rest of Tara's world. The next morning, the walls of Woodville High weren't just whispering, they were shouting. Her video circulated online. Not just any video, the one Sarah had anonymously leaked. Tara, pressed against the side of the music room, kissing Tyler like she owned the moment. The video was grainy but unmistakable. Tara, Tyler, the betrayal. By lunch, Kyle had announced the breakup in the cafeteria, loudly, publicly. Without hesitation, the room went silent. Tara stood, shaking, unable to comprehend how the boy she had twisted around her finger had suddenly found his voice. Sarah watched from a distance, brushing the dried glue on her locker one more time. The sting was still there, but now it felt different. Not a sting of pain, but of resolve. Days passed. The dynamics of Woodville High shifted like a river finding a new course. Tara, the once untouchable queen, became a shadow of herself. Amanda refused to walk beside her anymore. The other girls no longer giggled when she spoke. The whispers weren't about Sarah anymore. They were about Tara. Sarah felt no guilt, no glee either, just a quiet sense of balance. It was never about destroying someone for the sake of it. It was about making sure cruelty came with a cost. Then came the moment she had been waiting for. She arrived early, as always, brushing the dried glue one final time. Today, the janitors had promised to remove the sealed locker door. Today, She would have access to the books and belongings that had been sealed away for weeks. As she stood, brushing the edge of the dried glue, Amanda peered down the hallway. The girl stopped a few feet away, hands shaking. "Sarah," she called softly. Sarah turned. Amanda stepped closer, swallowing hard. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry. I didn't stand up for you. I watched, I laughed, and I can't undo that, but I want to be better. Will you? Can you forgive me?" Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat, not because Amanda was blameless, but because in that moment she chose to stand in her guilt, not to run from it. Sarah stepped closer, brushing Amanda's hand briefly. "Forgiveness doesn't erase the past," she said softly, "but it can help build a better future. Just don't forget what this felt like." Amanda nodded, brushing away a lone tear, and for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt like she could breathe. Then came the sound. A long, screeching whine as the janitors peeled the sealed locker door from its frame. The dried glue cracked and fell to the floor. The door swung open, revealing a world that felt like a relic from another time. Sarah stepped closer and pulled out the first book. The pages were crisp, the edges still faintly streaked with dried glue. But for the first time in weeks, she felt like herself. Not just a target, not just a victim, not a ghost. A new chapter was starting, one she would write herself. Then, down the hallway, Tara appeared, shoulders hunched, eyes rimmed with red, staring from a distance. No words came from her, no threats, no smirks, just silence. The silence of someone who had lost her throne. Sarah didn't gloat, didn't sneer. She didn't have to. The silence said enough, but as she pulled her belongings from the locker, brushing a hand across the dried glue one final time, Sarah felt a prickle at the back of her neck. Someone was watching. Not Tara, not Amanda, not Kyle. Someone unseen. Someone lurking. Someone who would soon make themselves known. Sarah tightened her grip on her notebook, felt the sting of the dried glue crack under her palm, and smiled faintly. The game wasn't over. Not yet. The shadow sorcerer stood in the quiet hallway, long after the janitors had gone, brushing a hand over the freshly opened locker. The dried streaks of glue were gone, scraped away, replaced by bare metal. Yet she felt a sting deep within, not just for herself, but for what this locker had come to symbolize. Humiliation, betrayal, survival. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. At first she ignored it, but then came a soft voice. Sarah. She turned to find Amanda standing there, shifting from foot to foot. Dark circles lined her eyes, and she held a piece of paper clenched in a shaking hand.
"Yeah,"
Sarah replied quietly. Amanda glanced down the hall, wary. I don't know if this means anything, but I found this wedged under the music room door." She held it out, a crumpled note. Sarah took it, brushing a finger across the hastily scrawled words. "Watch your back. Tara doesn't forget." A slow, icy wave rose from the pit of her stomach. Tara might have been humiliated, but she wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Sarah looked at Amanda, voice low. "Are you sure this came from Tara?" Amanda shook her head quickly. "I don't know. It could be one of her friends, or Tyler, or someone else. But you need to be careful." Sarah felt herself nod. Careful. The word felt foreign and bitter. Being careful was what she had tried for so long, keeping her head down, pretending she didn't notice the sneers and whispers, acting like the sting of bullying didn't matter. But this was different. This was a warning. Not for a prank. Not for a sealed locker. This felt darker. "Thank you, Amanda," she said quietly, brushing the paper between her fingers. Amanda offered a faint, sad smile before disappearing down the hall. Sarah watched her go and sank down beside the locker, pressing the crumpled paper to her chest. Somewhere between the sting of dried glue and the sting of betrayal, she felt herself harden, not out of cruelty, not out of a desire to destroy, but out of a desire to survive. That evening, she went home and pulled out the notebook, the one that had started as a journal and evolved into a map of connections, tensions, and secrets. The lines that connected Tara, Amanda, Kyle, and Tyler weren't just threads of high school gossip anymore. They felt like threads of a larger web. Sarah added a new page. Warning received. Source, unknown. Likelihood, Tara or associates. Objective, maintain vigilance. Identify the threat. Protect herself. She set down the pen and pulled out a second notebook, one she kept hidden at the bottom of a drawer. Inside were other observations, not just about Tara and her circle, but about Woodville High itself, its corridors, its blind spots, its moments of quiet. Sarah was no longer the girl with a sealed locker. She was a witness, an observer, someone who refused to be cornered. Days passed. The air in Woodville High felt charged, like a thunderstorm hovering overhead. Tara had disappeared from school for a week. Kyle kept his distance from almost everyone. Amanda tried to make amends in quiet gestures. A book offered here, a smile there. But then came the second warning. Sarah found it taped to the locker door one morning. Hastily scrawled across lined paper, "Last chance to walk away." Sarah pulled it down, brushing the dried tape from the metal surface. The sting of the warning felt sharp, not because she was afraid, but because she refused to give in. Not now, not when she had come this far. She clenched the paper in her hand and walked down the hallway, brushing past students until she found Kyle leaning against a window, looking exhausted. "Have you seen Tara?" she asked quietly. Kyle shook his head slowly. "No, not for days, not since." Everything came out. He glanced down, brushing a hand across the windowsill. "I tried to call her, tried to ask why, tried to make sense of it, but she won't pick up." Sarah watched him for a moment, noticing the heartbreak in his voice, not the shallow sting of a teenage breakup, the deep ache of betrayal. "She's not finished," Sarah said quietly, holding out the crumpled note. "Someone is trying to send a message. Someone wants me to walk away." Kyle's brow furrowed as he read the words. Slowly, he shook his head. "Sarah, this is bigger than Tara. You don't know what she's capable of when she's cornered. You don't know the people she can call when things get ugly." Sarah felt a prickle rise at the base of her neck. "Then tell me, Kyle, what am I dealing with?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then, brushing a hand across the locker, he spoke softly. "Tara's uncle. He's connected. Not the kind of guy you want to owe a favor. Not the kind of guy you want to piss off." Sarah felt the room shift. This was no longer about a sealed locker. This was about something darker, threads that ran deeper than high school drama. She pulled herself closer, brushing the dried paper between her fingers. "Then, help me, Kyle, not for revenge, not for some stupid win, but because I deserve to walk down this hallway and open my locker without looking over my shoulder." Kyle sank down beside the locker, brushing a hand across the dried adhesive that still lined its edges. "Sarah, you don't deserve any of this. None of this was about a locker, not really. Tara doesn't forget when she's humiliated, and when she can't win, she finds ways to ruin the people she blames." Sarah tightened her grip. "Then I'll be ready. Whatever she has planned, I'll be ready." Kyle met her gaze and offered a faint, broken smile. "Then you're stronger than I ever was." That night, Sarah returned home and laid out the threads, the sealed locker, the betrayal between Tara, Kyle, and Tyler, the crumpled warnings, the quiet silence that felt like a storm waiting to break. She added a new line to her notebook. "Warning intensifies. Source may be deeper than Tara. Involve Kyle, Amanda, others. Objective. Stay alert. Find proof. Expose the truth. End this." Sarah refused to be afraid. Not anymore. Not after weeks of being bullied, humiliated, silenced. Not when she felt the sting of dried glue every morning. Not when she felt the sting of betrayal every night. The next morning, she arrived early. The air felt sharp, charged. As she rounded the corner, she stopped cold. Her locker had been vandalized. Red paint streaked across the metal surface. Not words, not drawings, just a long, ugly gash of crimson, dripping down from the numbers. Sarah felt her breath falter. This wasn't just a prank. This felt like a warning, a threat. Then she spotted it. At the base of the locker, a photo. Not just any photo. A picture of Tara and Tyler, pressed together in a moment that no one was supposed to witness. The edges were torn, and a single word was scrawled across it in bold, sharp strokes. "Enough." Sarah sank down, brushing shaking fingers across the picture. This wasn't meant for Tara anymore. This was meant for her. Someone was trying to warn her, or scare her, or draw her into something deeper. Sarah pulled the picture closer, brushing a hand across the dried paint. This was no longer about a sealed locker. This was about betrayal and revenge, about secrets that refused to stay buried. And about a choice: run or stand and fight. Sarah pressed the photo to her chest and drew a slow breath. Whatever came next, she wouldn't run. Not anymore. Then came a sound from the end of the hallway, a sound she hadn't expected. the sharp clang of metal, the slow scrape of a door, and then silence. Sarah tightened her grip on the picture, brushing a hand across the dried paint. Somewhere down that hallway, someone was watching. Someone was making sure she felt every sting of dried glue, every sting of betrayal. Sarah stood, brushing herself off, brushing the dried paint from the picture. Whatever came next, she would be ready. The web tightened. Sarah stood in the hallway long after the sound of that scraping door faded, brushing dried paint from the photo clenched in her hand. The crimson gash across the locker felt like more than vandalism. It felt like a message, not just a warning anymore, but a challenge. Her heart pounded as she pressed herself into the shadows, trying to make sense of it all. Tara, Amanda, Kyle, someone else. The lines were blurring. The whispers weren't just about her anymore. They were about betrayal, obsession, and a revenge that refused to stay buried. Sarah pressed the photo of Tara and Tyler to her chest and drew a slow breath. Whatever came next, she refused to run. That afternoon, she spotted Amanda by the music room. The girl's voice shook as she spoke. "Sarah, you have to be careful. Tara's uncle, he doesn't just know people. He is the people. You don't want to make an enemy out of him." Sarah tightened her grip on the photo. Then why is she doing this? If she has that much power, why bother with dried glue and a vandalized locker? Amanda shook her head, brushing hair from her pale, frightened face. That's how terror works. The bigger the threat, the smaller the hint. The more she can make you fear her, the less she has to do. Sarah felt a sting rise deep within, not of terror, but of resolve. "Then she doesn't understand me," she said quietly. "I don't break because I'm afraid. I only break when I forget who I am." Amanda met her gaze for a moment, swallowing hard, then pressed a folded piece of paper into Sarah's hand. "I found this in Tara's locker before she disappeared. It's about Tyler." Sarah unfolded it slowly. The paper was lined and torn. A hastily scrawled note that read, "If Kyle finds out about Tyler and the accident, I'm finished. Do whatever it takes, even if it means making her disappear." Sarah sank down onto the floor, brushing shaking fingers across the words. An accident, a secret, a betrayal bigger than a teenage rivalry. Suddenly, the threads connected. Tara cheating, Kyle breaking down, Tyler hovering like a shadow. Whatever had happened between them hadn't just torn apart a high school clique. It had set a fuse on something darker. Sarah stood, brushing herself off, brushing the dried paint from her jeans. "Thank you, Amanda. Stay out of this if you can. Whatever this is, it ends soon." Amanda watched her walk away, brushing a hand across her mouth as if holding in words she couldn't say. Sarah refused to walk away. Not now. Not when the threads were starting to make sense. That night, she pulled out her notebook and laid every piece across the page. Tara and Kyle broken apart. Tyler tied to an accident. No one spoke about Amanda, a witness. Tara's uncle, a looming threat. The locker, the glue, the paint, a warning meant to silence, not kill. Sarah drew a slow breath and sank into thought. Whatever accident this was about, it was connected to Tyler. And if Tara was using it to keep Kyle under control, if she was threatening to make it disappear, then that accident held a truth that could end. Tara's grip over everyone. Sarah pressed the tip of her pen down and drew a circle. Find the accident. Find the truth. Then came a sound. Not a voice, not a warning, not a knock. The faint hum of a text arriving on her phone. Sarah picked it up slowly. An anonymous number. A single line. "If you want answers, come to the old bridge tonight. Alone." Sarah sank down, brushing the dried paint across the floor. It felt like a scene out of a nightmare, but one she refused to run from. The old bridge was a relic from another era. Its steel frame rose like a skeleton against the twilight, and its planks creaked under the weight of memory. Sarah arrived 10 minutes early, brushing dried paint from her hands and tucking the crumpled photo into her notebook. The air was damp, smelling of moss and rust. Then came the sound of a car door slamming. Footsteps. A figure emerged from the mist. Sarah froze, not because she was afraid, but because she felt herself shaking with anger, with betrayal, with questions that refused to be silenced. "Why am I here?" she asked sharply. Kyle stepped closer, brushing a hand across his tired, pale face. "Because I have nowhere else to go, Sarah. Because if Tara finds out about tonight, it's over for both of us." Sarah tightened her grip on the notebook. What accident? What is she hiding? Kyle sank down on the edge of the bridge, brushing a hand across the steel rail. His voice was low, shaking. 6 months ago, Tyler and Tara were driving. They hit a kid, a boy from a nearby town. Tara was behind the wheel. Tyler was too drunk to move. They left him there, left him to die. Sarah felt her breath falter. Not just betrayal, not just cheating or cruelty. This was murder. Kyle pulled out a piece of paper from his jacket. A police report, faded, redacted, torn from a larger file. Tara's uncle buried it. Tyler kept a copy. Tara found out and started threatening him. When he refused to stay quiet, she tried to ruin him, tried to ruin everyone connected to it, including me. Sarah sank down, brushing shaking fingers across the paper. Suddenly, every piece fell into place. The sealed locker, the dried paint, the threats. Tara wasn't just a mean girl. Tara was a weapon shaped by privilege, greed, and desperation. Sarah pressed herself to her knees, brushing the dried paint across the floor of the bridge. Then we end this, not with whispers, not with threats, not with revenge. We end this by telling the truth, all of it. Kyle sank down beside her, brushing a hand across the steel rail. Sarah, if we do this, if we expose Tara, her uncle will bury us. He has connections, money, power. People disappear when he snaps his fingers. Sarah met Kyle's gaze, brushing dried paint across the bridge floor like a mark of belonging. Then we do it smart. We do it together. We make sure that when the truth comes out, it can't be buried anymore. Kyle sank down beside her and offered a faint, broken smile. Why do this for me? Sarah smiled quietly, brushing a hand across the dried paint. Because no one deserves to live in fear. Not you, not Amanda, not the boy Tara left for dead, not even Tara herself. Then came a sound that sank deep into the mist, rising from the dark edges of the bridge. A sound that promised this was far from over. A car door slamming, a figure emerging from the mist. Someone had followed them. Sarah tightened her grip on the photo, brushing dried paint from the bridge floor. Whatever came next, she refused to run. Whatever came next, she refused to be silenced. The storm breaks. Sarah froze, brushing dried paint from the steel rail of the old bridge, as the sound of a car door slammed deep in the mist. The air felt electric, charged with a tension that refused to dissipate. Kyle pressed a shaking hand to his chest, and for a moment, the boy who had been a symbol of Woodville High's strength and bravado looked very much like a frightened kid. Then came the sound of footsteps, heavy, determined. A figure emerged from the mist, tall and looming, a man in a long charcoal coat. Tara's uncle, the one Amanda had warned about, the one Kyle had feared. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, not because she was afraid, she refused to be, but because she understood the magnitude of this moment. Everything she had uncovered, every piece she had put together, was about to be tested. The man stopped a few paces away, brushing a hand down the lapel of his coat. Kyle, he said slowly, voice dripping with disdain. I thought I made myself clear. Stay out of this. Stay quiet. Stay safe. Kyle rose slowly, brushing dried paint from the concrete, as if brushing away a memory. I tried, Mr. Hawthorne. I tried to walk away, tried to forget about that night. But she can't, and I can't. Hawthorne tilted his head slightly, brushing an old cigar case from an inner pocket. That accident cost my family more than you can imagine. And if you don't walk away tonight, boy, it will cost you even more. Sarah stepped forward, brushing dried paint across the concrete slab like a mark of belonging. If your family can bury a boy, bury evidence, bury guilt, then why is it so hard to bury the truth? Hawthorne froze, brushing the cigar case between long, calloused fingers. He glanced down at Sarah like she was an insect, brushing dried paint across the edges of his perception. And you must be the one who started this mess. The girl with the locker. The girl too stubborn to walk away. Sarah refused to flinch. The girl too stubborn to forget. The girl too strong to stay silent. And tonight, that silence ends. Hawthorne smiled faintly, brushing a hand across the steel rail. Big words for a girl with a sealed locker. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? Sarah pressed herself closer, brushing dried paint between shaking fingers. I know who you are. The man who buried evidence. The man who used fear and money to make a boy's death disappear. But tonight, you're dealing with a girl who doesn't break. Not anymore. Then came a sound. Not from Hawthorne. Not from Kyle, not from the mist, from the steel bridge itself. A faint hum, a phone vibrating dot. Sarah pulled it from her pocket, brushing dried paint across its surface. An anonymous number, an anonymous video, an anonymous witness. Sarah pressed play. And for a moment, the world stopped. The video was grainy, shaking but unmistakable. Terror behind the wheel. Tyler in the passenger seat. The sound of screeching tires. The sound of a boy's voice, panicked and silenced. The sound of doors slamming, of tires burning, of guilt buried under asphalt. Sarah pressed the phone closer, brushing dried paint across its surface. "How many copies do you think are out there?" she asked quietly, brushing dried paint across the edges of her voice. "How many people are tired of being silenced? You can bury one witness, you can bury one file. But tonight, Mr. Hawthorne, you can't bury the truth." Hawthorne sank down, brushing a hand across the steel rail like brushing dried paint from a canvas he refused to acknowledge. "What do you want?" Sarah stood tall, brushing dried paint across the bridge floor like a statement. "I don't want revenge. I don't want money. I want the boy you buried to have a name, a voice, a chance for justice. And I want Tara to own the guilt she tried to make everyone else carry." Kyle sank down beside her, brushing dried paint across the concrete like an oath. "And I want the world to know, this wasn't about a sealed locker or a broken heart. This was about a boy left to die. A boy none of you gave a chance." Hawthorne sank down, brushing dried paint across the steel rail like a man brushing dust. From a gravestone, the silence felt like a verdict. Not guilt announced by a judge, not punishment handed down by a court, but a silence that promised this was far from over. Then came a sound, the sound of a phone call being placed, the sound of a voice rising from the mist, the sound of a man making a decision. Hawthorne pressed the phone closer, brushing dried paint across its surface. "I'll make the call. I'll make this right. Not because of you, not because of this video, but because a boy doesn't deserve to be forgotten. Not tonight, not ever." Sarah sank down beside the bridge, brushing dried paint across the steel rail like a witness to a shift. Not victory, not vengeance, not the end, but a new beginning. Days later, Woodville High felt different. The sealed locker was opened. The dried glue was gone. The crimson paint was scrubbed clean. The whispers in the hallway weren't about the girl with the sealed locker anymore. They were about the boy buried under silence, about the accident buried under asphalt. Tara didn't return, not because she was hiding, not because she refused to own her guilt, but because the world she had built for herself, the world of whispers, cruelty, and silence was gone. Kyle sank down beside Sarah as she pulled a book from the freshly opened locker, not because she needed him, not because he wanted her, but because both of them had learned that silence doesn't heal, and strength doesn't come from cruelty. Sarah pressed a hand across the locker door, brushing dried paint from its surface like brushing away a scar. Not gone, not forgotten, but reshaped. Then came Amanda, brushing dried paint across the hallway like a witness stepping out of the mist. Not with guilt, not with terror, but with a quiet strength that promised this was a new chapter for all of them. Sarah sank down beside the locker, brushing dried paint across its surface like a final statement, not an ending, not a victory, not revenge, but a moment when silence became a voice, when cruelty became strength, when a boy left to die became a reminder that every voice, every witness, every scar can shape a new path. Sarah sank down, brushing dried paint across the floor, not to bury the past, not to forget the sting, not to erase the scars, but to remember that even the darkest moments can lead to light. Then came a sound, not a voice, not a witness, not a whisper, but the sound of a door opening, the sound of a boy's sister stepping down the hallway, brushing dried paint across the floor like a witness carrying a memory, the sound of a quiet thank you rising from the mist. Sarah sank down beside the locker, brushing dried paint across its surface like a witness, brushing a hand across a gravestone, not for glory, not for vengeance, not for herself, but for the boy, for the sister, for every witness that refused to stay silent. Then she stood, not as a girl broken by cruelty, not as a witness silenced by fear, not as a locker sealed shut, but as a witness, brushing dried paint across the steel like a scar that refused to disappear. Then she smiled, not because it was over, not because it was perfect, but because it was hers. The story, the silence, the strength, the voice that refused to be buried. Then came the sound of a door closing, not an ending, not a warning, not a threat, but a chapter that refused to be forgotten. Sarah sank down, brushing dried paint across the floor, brushing dried paint across the edges of herself, not broken, not silenced, not forgotten. But finished, but whole, but free. The final unveiling. Sarah stood in the quiet hallway one last time. The locker, once sealed shut and streaked with dried glue and crimson paint, was now clean. Its surface reflected the faint morning light, like a witness to the trials it had endured. The sting remained, not in the metal, not in the concrete floor, but deep in Sarah's heart. Not as a pain anymore, not as betrayal, not as fear, but as a reminder of how far she had come. Around her, Woodville High felt different. Not because the walls had changed, not because the people had changed, but because the air felt lighter, as if a long silence had finally been broken. It had been 2 weeks since the night on the bridge, 2 weeks since the video surfaced online, making its way to every phone in town. The boy Tara and Tyler had left for dead had a name now: Ethan Miller, a shy boy from the next town over, a boy with a sister and a family who refused to forget him. Sarah pressed herself closer to the locker and drew a slow breath. The dried paint was gone, but its faint echoes remained, streaks buried in the grain of the metal. They weren't ugly anymore. They were marks of survival. The sound of footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. Amanda emerged from down the hallway, brushing a hand across the locker door. "Hey," she said softly, brushing dried paint from her own shirt. "I just wanted to say thank you, not for what you did for me, not for standing up to terror, but for reminding me that the things we don't say can haunt us forever." Sarah smiled faintly, not because it was over, but because it meant something. "We were both scared, Amanda, but being scared doesn't mean we have to stay silent. You chose to speak when it counted." Amanda sank down beside her, brushing dried paint across the floor like a witness brushing away the dust. "What's going to happen to Tara?" Sarah sank down too, brushing dried paint across the floor like brushing a chapter closed. "The authorities have the evidence." The boy's sister came forward. "They're calling it an investigation for now. But Tara can't run anymore, not from this." Amanda sank down closer, brushing dried paint across the floor like brushing herself into belonging. "What about Tyler?" Sarah drew a slow breath, brushing dried paint across the floor like brushing threads apart. "He turned himself in. According to Kyle, he said it felt like the first time he could breathe in months. No more lies, no more guilt, just a chance to make things right." Amanda sank down beside her, brushing dried paint across the floor like brushing herself whole. "And Kyle," Sarah smiled faintly, "not because he was a hero, not because he was blameless, but because he chose to stand up when it counted. He gave the video to the authorities. He gave the evidence to the boy's sister. Whatever he does next, he has to do it knowing he chose the truth over silence." Amanda sank down closer, brushing dried paint across the floor like brushing herself awake. "And you, Sarah, what about you?" Sarah sank down too, brushing dried paint across the floor like brushing herself free. "Me," she said softly. "I learned that silence doesn't save you. It doesn't heal you. It doesn't protect you. It only buries you, under dried paint, under sealed lockers, under secrets that grow darker every day." Then she smiled faintly and pressed a hand across the locker door. "But when you stand up, when you walk down the hallway and open a door that refused to open before, you remember that even the smallest voice can shift the biggest silence. Even the weakest witness can rewrite a story. Even the broken can become whole." That afternoon, as the sun sank low over Woodville High, Sarah watched from the courtyard as the boy's sister placed a photo at the school gates. Not a photo of a tragedy, not a photo of silence, but a photo of a boy smiling, a boy named Ethan Miller, surrounded by friends and family. Sarah sank down on the steps, brushing dried paint across the concrete like brushing herself toward belonging, not because the scars weren't there, not because the sting was gone, not because she felt invincible, but because she felt alive, because she felt free. Free from the sting of dried glue, free from the sting of betrayal, free from the sting of silence. And in that moment, she understood the lesson that had taken weeks, no, years to learn. Sometimes, the biggest victories aren't won by making others pay for what they've done. Sometimes, the biggest victories aren't about destroying the person who tried to destroy you. Sometimes, The biggest victories come from rising above the silence, from brushing dried paint across the floor until the color shines through, from remembering that every scar can carry a story, and every story can carry a lesson. Sarah sank down, brushing dried paint across the floor one last time, not as a witness, not as a target, not as a girl with a sealed locker, but as a voice, a witness, a beacon for those who refused to stay buried. Then came a sound, not a voice, not a whisper, not a warning, not a threat, but the sound of a door opening down the hall, the sound of a new chapter beginning. Sarah sank down, brushing dried paint across the floor like brushing herself into belonging, not because she was broken anymore, not because she was afraid anymore, not because she was silenced anymore, but because she was finally herself. And as she stood, brushing dried paint from her hands, brushing dried paint from the floor, brushing dried paint from the locker that had tried to define her, one thought rose quietly to the surface. Sometimes you have to lose everything, every voice, every belonging, every piece of belonging to remember who you truly are. Sometimes the sting of betrayal is the first step to belonging. Sometimes silence is the first sound of strength. Sarah sank down one last time, brushing dried paint across the floor like brushing a witness to life, not as a girl defined by a sealed locker, not as a witness buried by dried paint, but as a witness reborn. And when she rose, brushing dried paint across herself, brushing dried paint across the floor, brushing dried paint across the locker, she smiled faintly and walked down the hall, head held high, heart beating strong, a witness, a voice, a witness to herself, a witness to the boy named Ethan Miller, a witness to belonging, a witness to belonging to herself, a witness to belonging to a world that refused to forget, a witness to belonging to a world that refused to stay silent. And in that moment, in that quiet hallway where dried paint met a beating heart, the lesson sank deep. Sometimes the biggest victories don't come from defeating others. Sometimes the biggest victories come from finding yourself. The end.